Whoa, everybody's here so early.
Yeah, we're already.
In the picture.
Okay.
Yes, you do. The else in the picture.
What do you know?
Yay. Hi, Carol.
Hey, Carol, you did it.
Welcome.
Thank you.
All righty. Give it another minute or so. Okay. Hmm. 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 Well, all right. Looks like 11:30. So as I mentioned, I'm going to try and cut this up more, and hopefully that'll make things a little more interesting. Yeah, I'm feeling very good about this particular new plan. I think we'll enable you to sort of get more explanation and for me to spend more time explaining some things. And that I think also will naturally allow for more questions, because I think it's probably maybe a little bit, I don't know, yeah, maybe intimidating, or you don't want to be rude to interrupt, or even if I'm encouraging you to interrupt, it might feel like. So I think if I'm the one doing all the interrupting along the way, it will create more space for that. So I was just going to go back to the interview that we had left last time, this dig podcast. And so the first things that I found are going to be in that, and we'll see what we can do with those pieces in there. There's a couple places I think where I want the guy who's doing the interview to say something, but mostly it'll just be listening to what Martin has to say, and us talking about that.
Could I ask a question?
Mhm.
This actually goes way back to the beginning. The topic of free will came up, and it occurred to me that Haglund, for Haglund, that would not even be a thing.
Right. He doesn't mention it.
That it wouldn't be because it depends on religious faith. Is that a fair statement?
No,
I mean, every class I've ever taken about theology, they're arguing all over the place about free will.
yeah. Well, I mean, it's true the strongest defense of free will is usually going to need to invoke something to guarantee it, something powerful like God to guarantee it. That if you're just left with the material world, it gets really difficult to try and figure out how you're going to argue that free will is fitting into that material world. So I think my guess is, sort of from spending a little time with his thinking, is that he would accept the basic idea that that free will as we experience it is primarily an illusion. But nonetheless, we do experience ourselves that way and in making decisions. And so regardless of whether you want to argue that it's a real thing in the material world or not a real thing, the fact that we're experiencing ourselves that way becomes the most important question for him. And so that's where all of that spiritual freedom is coming from.
But Richard,
Mhm.
doesn't he actually think that everyone should be a communist? So then, if we're all thinking the same, we don't have free. There is no need for a free will.
Well, he would definitely want to say that yes, he wants us all to be communists, but he thinks that that would enable us to be much more creative individually. So there might be, I mean, he would expect there are things that we are going to have to agree about, like, okay,
Yeah.
we're all sharing in this common project, but layered on top of that, he thinks there'd actually be much more variety in our politics.
I would tend to agree if all our needs are met, we would be free to think as we wish.
Yeah, yeah. That's that's a good way to put it. That if you have the material foundation that's not driving you to certain kinds of behaviors, then you're free to choose all of that for yourself.
Well, basically, though, that happens with aging. We are all pretty fortunate. Let's face it. Everyone who is in your class, we are financially fine. So that would mean that we have the free will to do what we with our money, or what does it mean with the free will?
No, he wants us to pay attention to the fact that even if you're comfortable in the way that in the system, that whatever's happened in your life is left, that you're comfortable in the system. The fact is, you still have to have spent and need to spend some time along the way planning for the fact that you need money and you have a future that you're going to need money in. And so to take care of yourself, you have to do some arranging of your life such that that's going to work out. The choices that you make are limited by the fact that you are the one who's responsible for your own well-being going into the future.
But that's the capitalist system.
Well, exactly. So as long as we're stuck in that system, we're all constrained because the need for money is going to be driving a lot of our thinking and choices.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take that out of the equation, if all of a sudden there is this material abundance and society organized around taking care of people, then you don't have those issues anymore. So you're free then to pursue whatever you want to pursue and think about things however you want. And we just have the kinds of things that would be political questions would likely be different kinds of questions. So, I mean, the world today, right? We still, even if something happened and we had the political economic system he wants, we'd still have this global warming problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's lots of different questions to ask and nuances about, which choices are we going to make as a society to try and deal with that? And those will have to be negotiated politically. So there's still a lot of room for people to have different ideas about how to do things politically, even if you have this society in which the material needs have been taken out of that equation.
What if my material needs are met, but my real passion and desire is to amass more money than anybody else?
Yeah, I think you might just say you're going to be frustrated.
It seems like human greed needs to be calculated into any equation.
Well, but our society promotes greed. What if our society did not? There was a time when conspicuous consumption was frowned upon.
I don't know. There were always people that had way more than anybody else and wanted it that way.
But we are also full of fear. We fear of one another. We fear of our life.
Mhm.
And I think that drives us to be
Yes.
self-centered.
Yes.
Exactly. So if the social arrangement isn't motivating those kinds of anxieties, then people aren't going to respond by feeling like they need more. And if just the economy is arranged so there isn't a point to, I mean, that also becomes another
Yeah.
way of looking at it is that there you could amass more, but in a communist society, a really advanced socialist society, there's nothing, there's no point to amassing more. It's not
Yeah.
doing anything. And so the motivation, the reward systems all change, and with that change, you're going to get a lot of different kinds of behavior out of that from people, and a lot of different ways of thinking that are they're just foreign to us at the moment because we're so
Yeah.
used to this way of living in the world.
Yeah.
Somebody said that we should just say, okay, once you've got $1 billion, you won. You won the game, and that's it.
You may as well say he lost. He lost.
Or
But you know, the thing is that we in Europe there is a so democratic socialist system. And I always think that there has to be money in order to do that. So we have to make money to live a life, a good life. How else would we live? We may share it, but we'd still have to make the money to healthcare and all that stuff. A pension plan, a pension that you don't work anymore, like we don't do bloody anything. So what is, so that we still need money. That's always my saying about democratic socialism. They say, oh yeah, well, you do this and that. Well, we still have to have money to have that system, unless we do away with all money.
Yeah, and in the end, that a communist society would do away with money. You wouldn't need it anymore. You'd find different ways of handling distribution problems.
Mm.
I mean,
But you would still be working. I mean, you would still have to
right.
have a job. Okay.
Yeah, and there's things that still need to get done. We still need someone who's going to maintain the water, treatment.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. But it's the point of work changes if you're not working because you have to do it in order to survive, but you're doing it instead to make a positive contribution to the world.
Yeah, it's a different focus, isn't it? As I heard you say that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Entirely different way of thinking about what the point of your activity in the world changes radically with that.
In the 60s, I thought I would save the world.
We all did.
Well, we all did.
That's why I majored in sociology. I thought I would save the world.
Turns out the world is more stubborn.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is too.
Well, the ego implied in that is.
Well, that's the youthful exuberance.
Yeah.
It's a good thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I live with so much poverty around me, so much people that are sitting on the streets and having nothing.
Yeah.
I don't know what you do. Would you not have that in us? We still have people who will be dependent on drugs,
Elena,
or alcohol.
Elena, I know everyone else probably knows this, but where did you grow up?
In the Netherlands.
In the Netherlands, okay.
And my whole family was communist socialist. So and lived there until I was 20.
Uh-huh.
And I took that with me, and my husband was a capitalist.
Uh-huh.
I made him into a socialist.
So there's a deeper thought in all of this that has to do with this issue about abundance or need, and a big part of what Marx was talking about in terms of this kind of change is that capitalism is an amazingly powerful thing.
Mm-hmm.
And once it is able to create enough development in the world so that there becomes a mass of wealth in the world because capitalism has done the thing that it does very well, which is also very brutal and leads to a lot of suffering, but it does this thing about development and creating wealth very well. So and a lot of people would argue we're there now. We've already passed that point, that there is enough wealth in the world now. The only problem left really is distribution. And so we don't have to keep doing those things that are hyper exploitive and lead to concentrations of wealth. We have a different problem. And we could just use that wealth in a radically different way than we're using it now. But the point is that for socialist thinking, all of that is premised on the fact that capitalism has done a good job of creating all of that wealth along the way at some point. This was a big part of the argument that with Lenin and the revolution in Russia is that capitalism hadn't done any of that yet. It's still capitalism still pretty early in Russia, and so Lenin is making this radical move where he's going to force into a socialist model the same developmental project that capitalism has. And so what you end up with then is Stalin. So enforcing this development model, which in the end was very productive, right? The Soviet Union becomes this very powerful country where Russia was this very backward country. And so the development work got done, but it required a lot of brutality along the way. Look at China, they're reaching a point they're where just in themselves are going to become a fairly wealthy country. But there were these decades where you hear all horrible stories about the exploitation. So the socialist thought is always assuming that there was a phase of brutal exploitation that we're past now.
Nancy said something. Nan.
Well, I said he was breaking up.
Oh, sorry. Do I need to repeat some of that?
Yes.
No.
Okay. Actually, given the questions here that you've started with, I think I'm going to skip to a different interview that's actually talking about some of these questions, since you've already started it. So what I'm going to start with is Hagelin talking about value, and he's going to mention the term species being, which is sort of this core question. If we're asking about people and people being greedy, the ordinary language people use to talk about that would be, well, what is there something about human nature that produces these behaviors? I mean, Christianity in the basic theology views people as fallen, and so in Christian thought there's this obvious argument that there's something broken about people that needs to be fixed. So that's an argument about a nature that human beings have. Marx is part of a movement that wants to reject the idea that there is a nature to human beings. But at the same time, he has to acknowledge that, if you compare human beings to other kinds of animals, well, we're different in some ways. You can find similarities in other ways too, but we're different in some ways. And you need some way to sort of talk about, well, what is it that humans do that other animals don't do? And, there needs to be kind of middle ground thinking in here. And Marx comes up with no, I don't think actually he came up with it. He just popularized it. Comes up with this phrase, species being. So the idea is not that there is a nature in terms of character that human beings have, or flaws in character from the Christian model. But there are ways of living in the world that are basic to being a human being. And those things might go in various different directions, but there's things that the human species has that are characteristic about it. And so Hagelin's relying a lot on this with the spiritual freedom idea, that for him that's part of the species being of humans, is that, and this is the early in the book, he likes the example of the seagull.
Mhm.
So this, which is, he's thinking about his childhood living on the coast in northern summer vacations in northern Sweden. But the seagulls have a way of living in the world. It doesn't seem to include stopping to ask, why am I doing this? Do I want to do something else? So humans, though, are the kind of species that has the capacity to stop and ask that question. And that's the spiritual freedom question, who is it I want to be? Why am I going to do the things I do? What am I choosing to do with myself? Now, the human nature argument would be, well, there's a character layered on top of that might be an acquisitive character or a greedy character. It's a fuzzy line. If you really want to argue, are you talking about human nature? Are you talking about species being? Because at the same time, it's also part of the species for humans that we're social.
Yeah.
And which is something that the other primates do too. We're a very, very social primate species. We're intelligent in terms of other species. And here actually the basic definition of intelligence, I came across this some years ago that I thought is always helpful for this kind of context. Intelligence is really pattern recognition. So the more sophisticated and adept and complicated the thought process is in finding patterns in the world, the more intelligent the creature is. Humans are really good at finding patterns. In fact, we'll find patterns that don't really exist. So we're so good at finding patterns in the world.
That's true. That's
And that's where animism comes from. You start believing in spirits because it becomes the easiest explanation for why did this happen. So we're really good at patterns, and so therefore very intelligent. So that would be part of our species being. Now, is it how prone we are, I think, maybe to those false positives might be the human nature, our character question. But the basic fact that we're very good at pattern recognition, that's just part of being human. But we're also spiritually free, and that's part of being human. Now, you can be spiritually free and be a greedy jerk, or you could be spiritually free and be a very humble and generous, sharing person. All of that is within the spiritual freedom of the human being. Okay, so that I think that's a good primer here. Let's see what he says about this. Which one is that? That's this life. No, it's not. Oh no, let me see here. Okay.
Thanks everyone for.
Okay, let's see here. 1630. And let me share my screen. All of these. Oh, nuts. And then, of course, I always figure out where they put the shared screen. Where did they put the shared screen? Oh, sorry, right there. Okay.
This question of value and what the book does with value, because on the one hand, there's a very technical sense of value and value form.
Okay, so he's starting off. They had asked him a question about this issue of value and what is it we value, and which is part of his critique about capitalism, that capitalism has just one way of measuring value, which has to do with, you know, how much exploitation you're getting out of labor primarily. So he's going to talk a little bit about that, and then he's going to go into the species being thing.
When in Marxist discourse, and one thing I want to bring out is precisely like that. It's not just a metaphorical connection between that technical sense of value and how value is produced under capitalism, and the question of like what we value existentially. You know, so one way of thinking about the book, it tries to show we can't actually separate economical questions from existential questions, which means that like all the Marxist concerns, while being deeply rooted in analysis of political economy, are also deeply relevant for understanding like how we learn what to value, how we value one another, how we relate to one another. So that's a way in which also I want to bring out that material questions, questions of historical materialism, are deeply related to spiritual questions. Here, not meaning spiritual in the sense of supernatural or having to do with an immortal soul or some sort of absolute peace of mind that we would achieve through meditation. On the contrary, spiritual questions are questions of what we value or what we take to be worth doing with our time. And we are spiritual beings, and here I use the term spiritual the way Hegel uses it, not because there's anything supernatural about us, but because we are social and historical beings who can question and transform our way of living. That's the distinct way in which we are living as natural beings, that it's an issue for us, how we should relate to one another, to ourselves, what we should value, and what we take to be worth doing. And our species being, in Marxist sense, as Connell reminded us, is precisely that, not that we have some essence, but that we are the kinds of beings who, for whom it is an issue, what we should do with our time, how we should relate to one another. And developing and actualizing our freedom is developing and actualizing our capacity to take ownership and responsibility for that question as social individuals. So I'm sort of reframing all of these questions about alienation, emancipation, about the social domination under capitalism and the possible emancipation under socialism as having to do with, in the deepest sense, our ability to lead and our lives as essentially social individuals, essentially dependent on one another, our ability to mutually recognize one another in our needs and abilities. So that means that the book doesn't want to make a choice between addressing those sort of large-scale questions, but also engaging in very technical debates about Marxist analysis of political economy. I want to show how all of these things can't be thought one without the other. So one thing I'm hoping with this panel is that we can sort of move between those levels precisely, both talking about so large-scale questions, but also how this can illuminate the stakes of what can seem like very technical debates in Marxism, but actually has to do with very concretely how we're able to take care of one another, to own the question of what to do with our lives.
So I think, I mean, Kirsten, part of what's complicated in all of these ideas is that we're so used to the world that we live in. Mm-hmm. And the way it's organized, that it's difficult to really put ourselves in a different kind of context that doesn't have the same cues in it that we're used to. And so I think one thing that's helpful to keep in mind there is to think about, well, there are things, I mean, the future, right? That's harder to kind of imagine yourself into because it's never existed. And so, we don't really know. But we can learn from the past, at least to make comparisons and and I think keeping in mind just how very different the world was under feudalism. And so much changes with the introduction of wage labor as the ordinary standard for how society is going to work. And that wasn't the way things used to be. There wasn't a thing called wage labor until capitalism comes along and wants to really use that. I mean, certainly people had worked for other people before, done things and compensated, but it's not the way the whole world's organized. So, feudalism, most people are serfs. So you live on a plot of land and you do whatever you do, and occasionally somebody comes by and wants to tax you. And so occasionally they also might want to draft you into their army and things like that. But it's the serf is not getting paid by the Lord. The serf pays the Lord, even though in terms of the basic power equation, the serf is clearly working for the Lord. But that the whole dynamic of the economy is different. And so it's not about wages, it's about rents. And so that's how feudalism works on rent. That's how money is made. People have to pay rent on things. So the serf is paying rent to the Lord for the land that the serf is working on. And the Lord is able to be rich because he's collecting rents from all of these different serfs on the land that the Lord has power over. It's a very, very different way of living than we have. And it's curious because it's in some ways more free and in other ways less free. And that's something I think it's going to come up here in a little bit. He's going to talk a little bit more about how capitalism sort of creates a context in which we can start to have questions about equality and freedom. Those ideas of the French Revolution, it simply would never occur to anyone that you could talk that way a couple hundred years before that, when feudalism was utterly dominant over everything. I mean, it's a long process for capitalism to become dominant. It really starts in the 1500s. It doesn't become really noticeable, in the way that people start talking about, oh, something's changed, until the 1700s. You get especially in Northern Europe and England, where that's where things really take off in terms of the capitalist way of doing things. So in one way, right, the serf is free to decide what they're going to do with their time day to day. There's going to be an obligation at some point that someone wants the tax. So, and you have to survive. So there are these demands on the serf to survive, to go out and work the land and do those things. But what time of day they get up, when they go to work, when they take a lunch break, how long that lunch break is, whether they stop to go to a religious festival or they, are going to take 2 weeks off and go on a pilgrimage somewhere. All of those things are within the freedom of the serf to decide, as long as they're going to be able to pay the taxes they need to pay and to feed themselves along the way and those kinds of things. But there's no one watching them. There's no overseer telling them what to do minute by minute. Yeah, Helena?
Well, aren't we actually also the serfs of the corporations now?
Well, there are similarities in the power dynamic, to be sure, that you can point to, right? And Marx at some places uses the phrase, well, again, I don't think he invented it. I think he popularized it, of wage slavery, that if you have to work for a wage, you're still a slave to the system.
Yeah.
But slavery in the American model is a variant on capitalist production. Mm-hmm. It's just the exploitation of the labor is so extreme that it claims ownership over it. But it's still oddly part of that capitalist dynamic, that the slave is working And it's just that instead of being paid wages, the slave is paid food and shelter, and everything else is taken from them. So the serf is still it's a very different kind of thing than the slave in the American model. Now there were slaves in the ancient world that look a lot more like that serfdom. The slave might have that kind of power relationship that their labor is all entirely owned by someone else, but they'd be it'd be assumed that they're still making their own decisions and doing things in their own sphere, and it's just all of the proceeds of that are being taken by the owner. I'm thinking about slavery in the Muslim model in the 1300s, or maybe think about slavery in the Roman model or Greek model back, just well, the Greek you could go back 300 BCE. So, but all of that is there's a way of organizing the world that has certain constraints, certain expectations, but also certain realms of freedom. Get to capitalism, and suddenly there's a different kind of realm of freedom that owns up because, and this is the language that Martin will use, that capitalism wants to assume that everyone owns their own labor and then is selling it.
Mm-hmm.
So when society sort of got to that point, now the slavery as we practice it here is going to be kind of this weird aberration variant on idea. But that's part of the contradiction that leads to the Civil War is that the industrial North, assuming that complete capitalist model, wants to operate in a society in which individuals own their own labor and individually are selling their own labor. And so with that comes a certain kind of freedom. But you end up where you have to sell your labor. And you don't necessarily have a whole lot of choice over who you're selling it to, even though in theory you do, that the labor is kind of interchangeable and you could take it here or there. In practice, there's certain skills you've learned over time and things you know and connections you have and whatever that are going to steer in certain directions, and that's what you do. And for most people in the world, it probably still tracks a lot of what did their parents do. That's going to be the thing they know the most about. But now they're going to sell their labor instead of being born on their parents' little plot of the farm in that medieval serfdom situation. Now, the other thing that's worth noting here is that people don't always respond well to these kinds of changes, and the freedom itself can be disruptive. This is the argument that Erich Fromm makes about where Nazism comes from in Germany is that part of his analysis is that the German masses were used to a lifestyle in which people told them what to do. That's as peasants. There is a structure, it all works, it's consistent and reliable over time for the most part. You get occasional wars and conflicts and diseases, but day to day, it's generally year to year, it's pretty relatively stable, right? The Dark Ages lasted 1,000 years in Europe. So you have this stability, you have this predictability, and then with capitalism, all of a sudden you have a lot of chaos. That the defining feature of capitalism is its instability compared to feudalism. There's an economic crisis every 5 to 7 years, and every 3 times there's a crisis, it's a really big crisis. And people lose jobs and firms close, and so you have all of this chaos that comes with capitalism, precisely because it was offering more freedom. So with the freedom comes chaos, and Fromm was saying, well, the chaos was sort of too much, and people reacting to that freedom and then experiencing too much chaos, they wanted they wanted the strong leader to come in and tell them to take over and tell them what to do and tell them everything will be okay. And I'm going to do this and you're going to do that. And everyone has a place again. So you don't have to figure it out for yourself. We'll tell you who you
Well,
are.
that's actually where we're in right now.
We seem to be repeating this problem.
Yes. So
yeah. Now,
how can we stop that then?
I don't know. I do personally have a lot of faith in education as a solution to a lot of problems. That if you have a really good education system, that people tend to figure things out a little more rationally. But this is a hard problem for human beings. It seems, because we keep falling into it again. It seems don't have the same kind of dynamic in that it's not we don't have the an experience, or at least our parents' experience or grandparents' experience of stability that in our comparison of chaos, because we've had enough capitalism and our grandparents knew the same instability that we know. But yeah, people still.
But also, there is
freedom
also
by rejecting it.
There is also this knowing that we're very much on our own. There is no, yeah. And I think loneliness or being alone is one of the curses, or the worst curses of this life right now. The loneliness. And that's why people, when they believe in God, at least they have a place to go, and they all think, well, the same thing, we go meet one another in paradise, right? But we don't have that.
Yeah.
The secular people do not have that. Well, I'm a humanist, and we meet maybe, once a week you can meet in the Unitarian Church, by the way. But it's not, well, it may be helpful in thinking, but not necessarily in doing. They don't do anything. Like, at least if you're in a church or in a temple, you do something for the other. You're meant to think to do something for the other.
Sometimes.
Ideally,
Sometimes.
yeah.
Ideally.
Yeah,
right.
That's the idea, though, isn't it?
But,
or not?
Why can't you? You could feel comfort in being with people right now in this life. I personally don't find it particularly comforting to think that there's going to be this other life I go to where everything's going to be fine. But right here and now, my friends, my network is my source of comfort, and it's enough for me.
Yeah, but the thing is, we die. So we lose our friends.
Yes, I know, and there's sad and there's sadness in that, but that's all part of it. That's part of what makes where I am right now, my friends, my what I do, that's part of what makes it so precious.
Well, I think what Hagelin's going to be arguing is that is what makes it precious. Not part of it is.
Yes.
The whole reason anything could be precious is because it could be lost.
Exactly.
It could be lost. It would be precious. Yeah. So we are definitely in this weird space where we have this freedom, but people are challenging it because the instability is too much for them, and that's a hard problem.
Richard, is it true that in ancient cultures, of course, we think of Greek and Roman, but Muslim or Eastern, it appears that no one came up with a study of economics or a philosophy of economics. Am I correct in thinking that? Even though economy is a Greek word, I don't know if the ancients didn't develop any structure around economy.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, it seems kind of like that.
Like Adam Smith just appeared to tell us about the economy.
Right, because with capitalism there were more questions maybe. And where the older systems there wasn't a lot of need for analysis because there wasn't as much and it wasn't the chaos of the cycles.
That's an interesting reason.
But I mean we certainly some there now I mean it's also too the language has shifted over time. 200 years ago, 150 years ago, they talked about political economy, and over time, we've sort of separated those things to talk about political science and talk about economics. So there's a deeper history in terms of what maybe is that the political analysis that was being done in the ancient world was just assuming a certain kind of economic thinking. Where when we get to our period you get the instability of capitalism, there's a lot more questions that get thrown up, and so now that economic piece becomes much more complicated and interesting for the sake of analysis, and so over time we've slowly figured out to create this thing called economics as a discipline for thought.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, so well, the next thing he goes on to in the interview I just queued up here is to talk about surplus time compared to surplus value, which relates to some of this, but in a lot of ways, some ways is getting into a little bit different point that he wants to make. I think I'll just let him say it and then I'll catch up. Oh my God, it's 12. See, this is, Joanne, you're so right. This hour-long class is just far too short. I don't know what I was thinking when I... Silliness. All right, we'll do a little bit here and then we'll keep going. Okay. 3150. There we go.
It's about surplus time, because in a way, I really think that's the key to the argument of the book. And one of the real breakthroughs for me in working on Marx was thinking about this relation between surplus time and surplus value. And again, it starts out from the fact that what's unique about living beings, as Matthew recalled, is that they produce a surplus of time. I have this plant next.
When he says Matthew, he was referring to one of the interviewers in this video. There was a conversation with 3 other people. So occasionally he's referencing things they said.
Next to me here, and even if I don't water it for a while, it can survive even without nourishment for some time. And other animals can use that surplus time to enjoy themselves, cats playing, dogs doing things. But what's unique about what I'm rational animals, what I'm calling it, that we don't just have that surplus of time. We can also ask ourselves what we should do with it and what's worth doing with it. And again, that's why we can produce surplus value in Marx's sense, but and can be exploited. I mean, if I had to spend all my time just surviving, then you could never exploit me to do anything else, because as soon as you force me to do something else, I would die. But it's precisely because I have this extra time that can be used for other activities. And the problem is not that we use that time for other ends than our own, but precisely that they are in the service of generating capital growth rather than expanding sort of meaningful social time. So the analysis sort of goes from that fundamental question of that's common to all forms of life, that we generate a surplus of time, but then what's sort of spiritually free is that, again, we can ask that question of what to do with our time. And that's supposed to be being into the distinctive sense in which we are responsible for the way we lead our lives. And that's precisely what's supposed to be distinctive of the kinds of animals we are. And a common misconception is that would then mean that we sort of have the right to exploit other animals or the natural environment. But my point is rather that like that sort of freedom is like what makes us more responsible than other animals. It doesn't necessarily give us more rights, but that means that we can be held accountable for how we treat the environment, for how we treat other animals. And that's part of the distinctive sense of responsibility that I want to say is like Marxism actually allows us to think through on the deepest levels.
Which is, yeah, and so this one's a really interesting point. Yeah, that it's in our species being that we're spiritually free. To be spiritually free, we have to have a surplus of time. And because of that, we are subject to exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
Someone can take advantage of our free time by coercing us to work for them and therefore extract value from us. So the reason for all of this is the reason it's important sort of theoretically is that there's this argument that starts with a guy named Ricardo, who's an important economist between Adam Smith and Marx in time. And Marx is heavily influenced by Ricardo's critical reading of Adam Smith. And so one of the ideas that Ricardo introduces is the idea that labor is the source of value. Or where does value come from? Where does wealth in a more ordinary language come from? It comes from labor. So you're right. If you listen to especially I think Republicans talk about capitalism, right? It's the value comes from the capitalist. It comes from the capitalist being the person who has this big idea and is organizing things. But the economic argument from Ricardo and then Marx is that no, all that value came from labor. And so you have to have so it's called the labor theory of value.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this is the long-standing argument in economics because the capitalist economists want to deny it, and Marxist economists have been pushing this and what it means and how you go back and forth. Lots of complicated debates in there. But Hagelin here is clearly defending the standard Marxist view that all value comes from labor. But what's interesting to him is just what's the backstory about why that's possible, which is this spiritual freedom.
So Richard, a quick question. So somebody once said to me that whoever developed, what is it, the sheet that has the liabilities and the assets, what's that called? I forgot. The
balance sheet?
Oh yeah, like the balance sheet, that whoever invented that could have easily put labor on the asset side, but instead labor was put on the liability side.
Because you have to pay it.
So I thought that was sort of interesting, and in a way that's what it is here. Is labor a liability or is it an asset?
Right.
I mean, you can't make anything without labor.
And so if you start with that capitalist assumption, it's going to see labor as this problem because it requires payment.
Exactly. And the ultimate goal would be slave labor.
Right. Yeah. It's the cheapest labor possible. Yeah. Where, from a socialist economic way of thinking, the labor has this completely opposite role as the creation of all value, and therefore it has to be respected, in a different way. It demands a different level of respect, I guess would be a way of putting it, as a result of that.
Mm-hmm. But as you say, it's education is the basis of it all. How we are educated, not only by our parents, but by outside forces. What schools we go to. Some of them go to elite schools. Mm-hmm. I went to Montessori schools all my life, so I'm influenced by that. Mm-hmm. And other people have look at the Black people. They weren't allowed to go. They weren't even allowed to read the Bible. I mean,
well, to be literate, it was.
You have to be literate, and you have to be able to think for yourself by thinking for the other.
Hmm. What say that a little differently?
Well,
not quite sure what you were getting at.
Yeah, I guess, I was in the theater for a while when I was much younger, and you had to do, when you do that, you have to go in the other person's shoes. So you have to you have to create in your mind that other person, the feelings, the emotions, what would it do? And that's actually very helpful. I always thought that theater would be a very good thing in schools to do because of that, because then you learn what the other person's needs are. And you're not only that self-centered being that I am.
So it encourages empathy.
Yes. And I think empathy is a great necessity in life. And it has to do with the imagination. He doesn't talk about the imagination, does he?
Well, his whole book is imagining a better world, I think.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
But no, but he doesn't, and he doesn't use the word, I don't think.
No, I don't think so.
Up. But relevant, I mean, he definitely talks about, there's one of the little clips I found somewhere anyway, had to do with utopian thinking.
Okay.
So he has some thoughts about that that we'll get to at some point.
That would be interesting.
Where was that? Okay, yeah, that was in that other interview, the end of that. Okay. All right, there's one. I think we have time for a little bit more. So this one is a bit about so the difference between us and animals.
Oh, yeah.
There we go.
Distinctiveness doesn't make us supernatural. It doesn't mean a rupture between the kind of animals we are and other living beings. But the distinctive sense of responsibility and why you can't collapse that distinction, you can bring that out very clearly by just posing the question. If you're going to collapse that, you have two choices. Either you have to hold all other animals accountable for how they prioritize their own species, then we have to hold lions accountable for killing antelopes. And so either you have to do that, or you have to exonerate us from responsibility, saying that like, oh, we are no more responsible than other animals for how we relate to other animals and to the environment. And those are really the only two options you have if you don't work out the right way of thinking about our distinctiveness. Again, either all animals are responsible and should change their sexism and speciesism and etc., or we are not responsible. So that's just the way in which it is uncircumventable to thematize for the very reasons. If we want to change and have a better relation to the environment, to other animals, that presupposes that we can actually take responsibility for how we relate to other animals, to the environment, and that we can change it. That's the way in which even a post-humanist critique must presuppose the distinctive kind of responsibility we have.
Okay. Post-humanist critique. What I think he's talking about is critiques of anthropocentrism. So the post-humanist critique is sort of looking at the way that humans behave and say, no, that's all anthropocentric. You've organized your whole world around what humans want. And in doing so, we tend to ignore things like what we're done to the planet and what we're doing to other animals. And so that's a bad thing. So the post-humanist critique comes along and says, okay, these are reasons why industrial farming is a bad thing. It's too human-centered. You need to center the interests of the animal more and not just ignore them. So it's post-humanist because it's looking at other sources for critique. So what is the animal's interest in all of this? But it's in all of that, somehow people do seem to get kind of caught into ways of thinking that well, if humans are just one kind of animal, if your post-humanist thinking goes to, well, humans are just one kind of animal, well, then animals do things, some animals are predators, lions eat antelopes, that's what they do. And, so if we're not going to have a critique about why lions are eating antelopes, what are you critiquing humans about eating cows about? Where's the basis of your critique coming from? Which sounds like it's missing something, is his point. And then there's this weird other side of the same coin. Now, he just wants to reject this coin rather than see which side of it makes most sense. But the other side of this coin then is that, well, we of course we want to hold ourselves responsible because you can't do mean things to other animals. That's just wrong. And so if you look at the lion eating the antelope, well, that's just wrong, right? It's causing suffering on the antelope. Therefore, we should stop that. Okay. And there's actually one of the most prominent philosophers in America today is a woman named Martha Nussbaum.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Actually wrote a book a couple of years ago, which seems to argue this point, that we need to stop the lions from eating the antelopes. And it's this argument she's making, this post-humanist argument. It's like, well, because we're going to have ethics, we got to have ethics. Therefore, the lions are going to be included. And I have friends who are big fans of hers, and this comes up occasionally in conversation. And in the end, most people just shake their head. It's like, I don't know what is she trying to argue here? So anyway, what Hagelin's doing instead is to say, that's just you guys have just gotten totally off track. You're missing the whole boat. Yes, humans are animals like other animals, but each animal has its own species being, and it is in the species being of the human animal that it has the spiritual freedom to ask questions like, should I eat meat? Or if I'm going to eat meat, how am I going to treat the animal? Lion does not have the spiritual freedom to ask that question. So anyway, that's it's not a particularly important point in the whole scheme of things, but I just wanted to draw that in real quick because it's a really weird conversation going on in the world today. It's worth your knowing it's happening. Okay, here we've reached 12:30. Anyone have any last comments or questions?
I thought we were going to go to 1.
No. I said what I was saying is I don't think it's fair of me to change that up.
Okay.
I can change what I do inside the class time as much as I want, but I think suddenly saying, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to extend class time," I don't think that's really quite fair because you all might have plans you've made, and
I see.
So that has to come for the future.
What was the name of that woman who wrote the article for the book again?
Martha Nussbaum.
Yeah, Nussbaum.
Nussbaum is N-U.
Yes,
It's just N-U-S-S.
Yeah.
But
Google
Richard,
find it.
But Richard, I think that's, at least for me, it's a helpful distinction to say we can ask the questions, but animals can't. Yeah.
And be responsible.
Then therefore responsible.
And therefore
yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Therefore they're not responsible, but we are.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and many people do not know that a cow, when it has a calf and you take it away, the cow goes into deep depression for months.
Yeah,
and it gets very angry, and it has this. I didn't know that. I just learned that about 2 years ago, and now it's become very difficult to eat a cow.
There's I heard an interview with a guy. I think he's actually a neuroscientist, and during COVID, he bought this little farm because he needed something to do, and bought a bull and 2 cows from one of his neighbors, and the neighbor said, "Congratulations, they're pregnant." So in a couple of weeks, he had a little herd of 5, and he wanted to commune with nature. That was the whole point of having the farm. And so he took to spending a lot of time with the cows, and even at one point realized that he could hang out with the bull, and even go and like lay down and lay on top of and lean against the bull. One of his neighbors at one point came by and said, "Oh my God, you're gonna die. You can't do that." Now the neighbor and some other neighbors come over for what they call bull therapy.
Yes.
Hang out with the bull and sit down on the ground and lay around.
My friend and I did that 2 years ago. We went all around Seattle trying to find a farm where we could hug a cow.
Yeah.
And that's where I learned that the cow gets angry.
He wrote this book called Cow Puppy.
Oh.
And he's actually saying, that what he's realized is that compared to the way dogs behave, the cows are really much more social. They seem to actually like each other. We have 3 dogs. The dogs get along fine, but it's not they actually like each other. They don't really care if one of them gets taken away, like to go with my wife will take one of the dogs away overnight somewhere, and the other 2 don't seem to care. But he said, they get a little despondent and distraught if you take one of them away, like for veterinary care or something, and it's gone, and they really seem to miss each other. I thought it was just the sweetest thing.
Yes, it is.
They're really social creatures, and we don't respect that nearly as, and with horses too, we don't respect it nearly as much as we should. No. Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Let's go very fast. All right,
bye.
We'll see you next week.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.